The chill tonight hums like a forgotten lullaby, carried on the breath of pine trees swaying just beyond your window. In the distance, a faint murmur of moving water rises and falls like the chest of a slumbering beast. Let the scent of damp moss and wood smoke curl around you as the darkness softens your limbs. You are not here anymore. Not really. You are elsewhere, long ago. In the year 849, under a moon swaddled in gauze-thin clouds, a man named Erland stirred from a shallow sleep. The walls of his longhouse creaked as the wind passed through the thatching like fingers combing hair. Outside, the snow had thinned, but not vanished, leaving brittle patches across the earth. Spring was slow to come that year, and the river near the edge of the woods, called Skarnelven by the village folk, remained half-frozen, groaning softly beneath its icy skin. Erland, whose beard bore the first frost of age, had not always lived near Skarnelven. He had once sailed far, westward, then northward, then back again, chasing gold and tales. But now he found more comfort in stillness than glory. His knees ached when he rose, and his shoulder never healed quite right from a spear thrust taken years ago on the stone beaches of Strathclyde. Still, his sleep remained light, as it had always been, stirred by the whisperings of night creatures and the groans of wind through the rafters. On this particular night, it was not a fox's cry, nor the settling of timber that roused him. It was silence, a sudden absence of sound. The river had stopped. It was a sound he knew well, that soft, watery chorus of melt and current and stone. To have it silenced felt like the world holding its breath. He stepped outside, barefoot on the dirt-packed floor of the longhouse, and stood for a moment beneath the stars. The sky was clear, and the snow that remained glistened like salt scattered over ash. The river was still, not frozen, not flowing, still. They said the old gods still lived in the water here. Erland did not consider himself a fearful man, but even he, when younger and more defiant, had not walked along Skarnelven's banks at night. It was not forbidden by law, only by stories, stories told in whispers when the fire had burned low and the children had pretended sleep. Warriors who strayed too close at nightfall spoke afterward in strange tones, if they spoke at all. One man had waded in with drunken laughter and returned with white hair and an empty gaze, muttering of pale limbs beneath the current and a woman's voice that echoed only inside his skull. There were no words in the sagas for such a thing, for warriors did not often speak of fear. But fear was there, in the hush after dark, in the way dogs would not cross the stone path that neared the water, in the way birds flew wide around the bend in the river, even during day. Something old lingered in Skarnelven, something that remembered when the land was young. Erland turned back into the house, poured himself a ladle of water from the barrel, and sat beside the hearth. Embers breathed faintly beneath a thin lid of ash. He stared at them as one might stare into another's eyes, trying to read what could not be said aloud. His son, Halvor, had gone to the river that morning. He had taken the fishing spear, saying the ice had softened enough to reach the deeper pools where trout would be sluggish and easy. Erland had said nothing then. Halvor was 17, proud and eager, and full of that invincible belief that age cannot teach. It must be earned by breaking. The boy had not returned before sundown, but Erland had not worried then. He had lingered beside the hearth, expecting the door to creak open any moment with the flush-faced youth grinning, fish in hand, stories tumbling behind him like fresh snow from a branch. But the door had not creaked, and now the river had gone silent. Have you ever wondered what it feels like when dread is not loud, but quiet? Not a scream or a crash, but the way frost creeps into the corners of your bones, unnoticed until you try to move? Erland waited through the slow dark. Hours passed like syrup poured from a horn. When dawn finally approached, tinting the sky with a diluted pink, he wrapped himself in wool and leather and stepped outside again. He did not wake the others. This was not their burden. The old ones in the village would tell him to wait, that the river took its own tolls and returned them only if it wished. But he was not a man built for waiting. He had done enough of that in the wars. Enough of that at sea, watching the horizon remain unchanged for days at a time. The forest was brittle with thaw and rot. Bark peeled in strips from the ash trees, and ravens clacked irritably from high branches, puffed against the cold. Erland followed the path toward Skarnelven. Not the wide road used in summer, but the narrow deer trail behind the hillock where moss grew thick. It was the path his wife once used to gather herbs. She had died many winters ago, and he no longer remembered the shape of her voice, only the color of her silence. The river lay just beyond the grove. Mist hovered low, as though the water was exhaling slowly. Erland crouched beside the edge and studied the current. It moved now, faint ripples lapping against a fallen birch branch. But there was something else, a pattern, not natural, like the back and forth swaying of something tethered. He reached out with the end of his spear and hooked it around what floated there. The shape resisted at first, then yielded. A pale wrist, bent awkwardly, surfaced. Halvor. The boy's eyes were closed, face unmarked. No sign of wounds, no bruises, no torn skin, as though he had simply surrendered to the water. But his mouth was open, and inside, packed neatly between his teeth, were river reeds tied with flaxen thread. Erland pulled the body to shore, knelt beside it, and touched the boy's cheek. Still warm. The elders would say it was punishment. The river was not to be disturbed after sundown, and Halvor had done so. They would say he had not listened, that the old stories are not told for pleasure. They are warnings dressed as whispers. But Erland did not believe the river punished. Not like that. He believed it remembered, and memory, like a river, can be both still and deep. The wind shifted gently across the clearing, and with it came the scent of thawing earth, mud-rich with rot and moss, the lingering breath of winter mixing with the coming sigh of spring. Ravens had taken to circling the river bend that morning, silent now as Erland knelt beside his son, brushing away the waterlogged reeds pressed into the boy's mouth. They were not knotted by accident. No gust or wave had tangled them so carefully. The flaxen thread was wound with an old woman's precision, yet it gleamed faintly, too fine for the village spinsters, and too pale to have been made from the usual wool or flax. The water lapped quietly against the boy's side. Erland sat back on his heels and exhaled slowly. The cold no longer bothered him. Beneath his knees, the earth had a softness to it, as though something just under the surface waited to rise. But nothing came. Not then. The villagers were not surprised when Erland returned carrying Halvor's body. Only the children wept. The old ones simply looked away, their lips drawn tight as if they tasted iron on the air. There was no weeping in the square, no wailing to call down the gods, only the quiet preparation for death. Halvor was laid in the drying house beside the smoke-curing meats. His mother's old cloak, still scented faintly of rosemary and juniper berries, was draped over him as a shroud. Erland did not light the pyre that day, nor the next. He spent his hours sharpening an axe that no longer had use and speaking aloud to the hearth as though it listened. It was not madness. Not quite. More like habit. 3 nights passed. On the 4th, a visitor came to the village. She arrived just before dusk, walking the northern trail that few dared take after autumn. She wore a cloak dark as crow feathers, heavy with bramble burrs and dirt crusted into its hem. Her hair was silver, though her face was not old, not quite. Her steps were slow but purposeful, as though she walked not toward something, but away. She stopped in front of Erland's home without knocking. He was already seated by the fire, and when he looked up, she was standing in the doorway as though she had always belonged there. "You lost something," she said. He said nothing. Her voice had the quality of driftwood, worn smooth by water and time. "A boy," she added, stepping inside without invitation, with a thread in his teeth. Erland nodded once, more in reflex than trust. The woman knelt by the hearth, warming her long fingers. "You should not have brought him back," she murmured. "The river does not give without price." Erland studied her more closely now. Her eyes did not settle in one place. They moved constantly, not with nervousness, but as though following things no one else could see. The villagers would have called her a seeress or a madwoman. The line between the two was narrow as a blade. "What does the river want?" Erland asked, his voice low, not wanting the question to echo. She smiled faintly. "It doesn't want. It remembers." There it was again, that word. He stirred the fire. The pop of sap in the logs startled a black beetle from a crack in the stone. "Then tell me what it remembers," he said. The woman settled into the woven chair across from him, drawing her cloak tight. "There are rivers that only carry water," she said. "Skarnelven is not one of them. It carries memory, old and dark, and it does not forget those who walk its banks after sundown." Erland's face twitched. "Then why build a village here?" She raised an eyebrow. "Do you think it was built? Number it was placed, like a pebble dropped into a stream. Sometimes the river moves around us. Sometimes it takes us with it." He stared into the fire. The shadows shifted like fish beneath the surface of light. The woman continued, her voice soft and deliberate. "There is a story, older than the oldest saga, before the Aesir, before the Vanir, before the gods put names to the stars. In those days, the river was a mouth, and it swallowed freely." Her hands moved as she spoke, tracing the shapes of things unseen. "Once, a war band camped near this place, long before your grandfather's bones returned to the earth. They were fierce, known for taking what they wished. Women, gold, oaths. One night, they crossed the river by moonlight. They said it shimmered like a path of light, inviting them. When dawn came, only one returned. Erland felt the cold move up his spine. He did not speak again, but he carved a pattern into the bones of his arms, not runes, not marks of prayer. They were knots, braided twists like those found in flax, the same thread your boy held in his teeth. Her words fell like frost, quiet, inevitable. "What binds the river?" Erland asked, voice raw now. She paused. "Names? And silence?" He frowned. "That's riddle talk." "It's all the river will accept," she replied. They sat in silence then, the way only two people who understand the cost of speech can sit. Outside, night pressed against the walls like damp wool. The fire dimmed. The visitor rose to leave. He was not taken, she said softly, pausing in the doorway. He was chosen. Erland stood. Chosen for what? But she only shook her head. That is not mine to say. But if you want him back whole, if you want to keep what is left of him, you must go before the moon is next full, alone, and you must not look into the water. He watched her vanish into the dusk, swallowed by the same path she'd arrived on, leaving only a faint scent of peat and snowmelt behind. That night, Erland did not sleep. He carved lines into driftwood instead, copying the knots he remembered from the reeds. But they made no sense. They were not charms, not runes. They held no protection, only pattern. And yet, something in them hummed faintly beneath the grain, as though they were meant to hold a memory he had not yet remembered. In the morning, he visited the drying house again. Halvor's face looked peaceful, but too pale. His lips were dry, and something under his eyelids pulsed now and then, like a fish twitching in its final dream. Erland pressed his hand to the boy's chest. There was no heartbeat, but there was warmth. Not from the fire, not from breath, but warmth nonetheless. He turned back toward the river. The village noticed, of course, but no one stopped him. Some shook their heads. Others whispered to their gods, but none followed. He walked as the sun dropped toward the western ridges, taking only a knife, a water skin, and the carved piece of driftwood. No weapon, no torch, no offerings, only memory. By the time he reached the bank, the sky was silver and bruised, the moon rising slow and full behind the veil of birch branches. The river moved again, but not like before. It pulsed. It breathed. He stepped close. Halvor, he said, his voice the gentlest it had been in years. I did not teach you everything. I left too much unsaid. A wind rolled down the valley then, not sharp, but deliberate. The surface of the water stilled, and something began to rise. At first, he thought it was a branch or drift. Then he saw the outline of limbs, narrow, jointed, but not entirely human. More like bone, remembered by water. The figure was not Halvor, but it bore his height, his weight, the shape of his shoulders, but stretched, water-warped. It stepped onto the bank. Its eyes were hollow. Its mouth was filled with knotted reeds. Erland did not flinch. He held the driftwood forward. I want him whole, he whispered. The figure tilted its head, as though considering. Then it turned back into the water. The river pulled it down. Not quickly, not forcefully, just a long, slow return, like breath sinking into the chest. And with it, the hush fell again. Erland stood alone, but not entirely. Behind him, something moved. He turned. Halvor, the real Halvor, standing, blinking, wet, alive. No reeds in his mouth, no memory in his eyes, only a question. Father? Erland took one step forward, but the river behind him let out a soft sigh. Something else had been taken in return. A hush settled over the banks of Skarnelven, so complete and deep that even the trees seemed reluctant to rustle their branches. The boy stood at the edge of the grove, damp and blinking, as if just awoken from a long, heavy sleep. His hair clung in thin, wet strands to his forehead. His clothes were soaked but intact. And most of all, most impossibly, his chest rose and fell with breath. Erland did not move. Not yet. Something in the air had changed. The wind no longer whispered. It listened, as if the river itself waited, curious to see what Erland would do next. Halvor shifted his weight on the mossy ground, his bare feet pressing into the earth as if unsure whether it would hold him. He looked down at his hands, turned them over, then looked back to his father. There was no fear in his face, no understanding either, just the wide-eyed daze of someone pulled too early from sleep. "Father?" he asked again, voice hoarse, like wind rasping over stone. Erlend stepped forward slowly, his boot sinking slightly into the softened ground. When he reached the boy, he touched his shoulder gently, as if to confirm this was flesh, not fog. The warmth beneath his fingers was real, but Erlend had lived too long, seen too much, to accept such a miracle without asking what it cost. Halvor flinched at the touch. Erlend pulled his hand away. "We'll go home now," he said quietly, not asking, not leading, only stating it aloud, as if to remind the woods that the boy now belonged to the world of the living once more. They walked in silence back through the undergrowth. The birds had not returned. The insects had hushed. Even the usual twilight chorus of frogs and foxes held back, as if the woods themselves held their breath. It was only once they passed the boundary of the first split pine, the one the villagers marked with red ochre in the spring. That sound resumed. A squirrel clattered through the branches above. A dog barked distantly from the settlement. The world exhaled. The villagers gathered when they returned. Some crossed themselves in quiet mimicry of Christian visitors long since gone. Others averted their eyes. The old women began whispering before they were even within earshot. Halvor seemed unaware of it all. He walked as if through a dream, eyes never quite meeting anyone's, hands loose at his sides, posture neither proud nor afraid. He let Erlend guide him to the longhouse and into the hearthroom, where the warmth embraced them both like a waiting shawl. "I'll make you something hot," Erlend said, but the words felt heavy, foreign. Halvor nodded absently and sat beside the fire. Erlend stepped into the side pantry to gather dried herbs. When he returned, he found Halvor watching the flames, his expression unreadable. "You've changed," Erlend said, not unkindly. Halvor blinked, as if startled. "I don't remember much. Just water. It wasn't cold." Erlend stirred the herbs into a clay pot and set it over the flame. "Do you remember what happened?" The boy was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I think someone spoke to me." Under the surface, Erlend sat across from him, arms folded. Her voice was soft, Halvor continued, but she wasn't kind, not unkind either. Just old, older than memory. She said the reeds remember everything, that they grow where silence lives. Erlend swallowed hard. "And she let you go?" Halvor turned his head slowly toward his father. "No," he said. "She said you traded something." The pot began to boil, and Erlend rose to remove it, glad for the excuse not to answer. He handed Halvor the cup, who cradled it in both hands and stared into the steam. Outside, the moon rose again, smaller now, but still full enough to cast silver lines across the village. Erlend did not sleep that night. He sat in the doorway with his axe laid across his lap, though he did not expect to use it. He simply wanted the weight of something solid in his hands. Have you ever held a blade not to defend, but to remember what is real? Steel is honest. It does not lie like dreams do. At some point before dawn, he heard movement behind him. Halvor stood in the doorway. "She left something," the boy said, voice barely a whisper. Erlend turned. "Where?" Halvor pointed to his chest. "Here." The next day, the villagers sent word to the Volva. An elder seeress who lived far to the east, past the Iron Hills. Few ever sought her counsel unless the usual rites failed. But Erlend did not wait for permission. He packed a satchel with hard bread, goat cheese, and cured fish. He left Halvor with the widow Anya, whose hands still remembered how to soothe children, even if her own had long passed. The path to the Iron Hills took 3 days on foot. Erlend traveled mostly by night, preferring the quiet. The woods along the edge of the ridge were thicker, older, filled with trees that leaned like eavesdropping crones. He arrived at the foot of a cairn-ringed hill, where smoke rose faintly from a stone chimney. The Volva was expecting him. "I felt the reeds twist 3 nights ago," she said, not greeting him, not smiling. Erlend bowed slightly, the way warriors bow to those they do not understand. She led him into a circular room packed with bones, feathers, dried herbs, and cracked bowls etched with fading runes. The walls smelled of pine tar and honey wax. It was not unpleasant. It was simply old. "You brought your son back," she said. Erlend did not speak. She studied him carefully, her one good eye a milky blue. "But something else went with the river." He nodded once. "What did it take from you?" she asked. He hesitated. "I don't know. Not yet." She stirred a thick paste from her bowl and spread it onto a circle of birch bark. Into the center, she pressed a single reed, dry, knotted, familiar. "You will know soon," she said, "but I can tell you this. When a soul returns from the river, it does not come empty." Erlend looked at the paste and the reed. "What does that mean?" The Volva answered slowly. "It means your son carries part of the river now. Its breath moves through him. Its silence weighs in him. And you," she looked up, "you carry its debt." The wind pressed against the thatching above them. "What should I do?" Erlend asked. She offered no comfort, only truth. "Watch him. Not with fear, not with blame. Just witness the river leave signs. They will come in dreams, in echoes, in the way birds fly when he enters a field. But you must never ask it to take the debt back. It has already chosen. To ask again would be to open a deeper current." Erlend returned home as snow began to fall once more. The spring had retreated, and the trees wore white again, as if winter had changed its mind. Halvor stood outside when Erlend reached the edge of the village, watching the sky. "Did you find answers?" the boy asked. Erlend placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Some." Halvor looked into his father's eyes. "I'm different, aren't I?" Erlend hesitated. Then he said, "You're here." That night, Halvor slept beside the hearth. Erlend watched the rise and fall of his son's chest. It was slower than before. Not unnatural, just deeper, steadier, like the rhythm of water moving beneath ice. In the darkness, Halvor began to murmur. Not words, not language, just patterns. And the reeds in the bundle by the door began to twist ever so slightly. The wind returned by morning, brushing the rooftops with soft, persistent fingers. Snow clung to the eaves of the longhouses and nestled gently in the ruts between footpaths, as if winter had decided to stay one more night, one more breath. Inside Erlend's home, the hearth still glowed faintly. The fire had not gone out, though no one had stirred it. Halvor slept beside it, curled toward the warmth, breath slow and measured, as if his chest held a tide rather than lungs. Erlend sat near him with a wool cloak draped across his shoulders, one hand on his knee, the other resting loosely on the carved driftwood from days before. He had not meant to fall asleep, but something about the steady rhythm of the fire and his son's breathing had softened the edges of his thoughts. He had drifted somewhere in between. It was in that space, between rest and wakefulness, that he heard it. A soft creaking sound, like ice cracking beneath gentle pressure. Then a hush, as though the sound had slipped away before it could finish its meaning. Then words, not spoken aloud, not exactly, but placed in his mind with the weight of stone dropped into deep water. He carries us now. Erlin's eyes snapped open, but the room was still. No figures stood in the doorway. No shadows lingered. Only the drifting scent of damp wood and faint smoke. Halvor turned slightly in his sleep, murmuring something inaudible. Erlin leaned closer. The boy's lips barely moved, but the words, if they could be called words, flowed in a smooth, seamless string of syllables, too fluid for any Norse tongue. Not a chant, not a prayer, a pattern. And the reeds, once bundled neatly and hung by the door, had begun to fray. Their threads unraveled slowly in the silence, without touch and without wind. Erlin rose and crossed to them. They hung limp now, no longer wound, their fibers pale and wet as though they'd been returned to the river. He took one in hand. It slipped apart with the slightest pressure, like something that had already let go. Behind him, Halvor stirred and sat up. His eyes were open, but not fully awake. He looked around the room as though it were new. I dreamed of fish, he said, but they weren't swimming. They were floating, upside down, like they'd forgotten how to move. Erlin studied his face. Do you feel ill? Halvor shook his head. Just cold. You're near the fire. I know. That afternoon, Erlin took Halvor to the grove just west of the village, where birches leaned toward one another like whispering kin. They often came here in the warmer months, to trap rabbits or gather berries. But now the earth was still slumbering. Frost laced the roots, and the sky above remained heavy with unspent snow. Do you remember this place? Erlin asked gently. Halvor looked up at the canopy. I remember the way the wind sounded here, like it was hiding something. Erlin nodded. They sat on a flat stone near the old fire pit. Silence hung between them, but not an uncomfortable one. The sort that stretches and folds rather than presses. After some time, Halvor said, there was a woman in the water. Erlin didn't respond. He waited. She didn't look like a woman. Not at first. Just light, like the sun through deep waves. But I knew it was her. Erlin turned to face him. Did she speak? Yes, but not in words. She showed me things. What kind of things? Halvor's gaze dropped to his hands. People who disappeared. Warriors. Children. Their faces were calm, like they were sleeping. But they weren't sleeping. They were waiting. For what? Halvor hesitated. For someone to carry them. Erlin felt a hollow sensation open in his chest. Carry them where? Halvor looked up then, his eyes clearer than they had been since his return. Through me, he said softly. Erlin placed a hand on his son's shoulder, grounding him. You don't have to carry anything you don't choose. But Halvor only smiled, faint and strange. I didn't choose. The river did. That night, Halvor did not sleep beside the fire. He asked to lie in the sleeping nook once shared by his mother. Erlin gave no objection, though something about the request made the house feel quieter than it had in years. The wind howled once, long and low, around the eaves of the home. Erlin sat by the hearth, alone again, carving shapes into the driftwood. Not runes, not letters, just knots, circles within circles, threads that could not be untangled. Sometime after midnight, a knock came at the door. He opened it to find Jorund, the village herdsman, wrapped in a thick coat and smelling faintly of smoke and hay. There's something in the river, Jorund said, voice taut. Erlin nodded, stepping outside without a word. The two men walked side by side down the well-worn path to Skarnelven, their boots crunching on frost and old leaves. No one else stirred. No torches lit their way. The moon had thinned since the night Halvor returned, now a wan curve like a smile drawn in breath. When they reached the bank, Jorund pointed. A deer, young, perhaps a yearling, stood half submerged in the shallows. Its head drooped, but it did not appear injured. Water lapped against its flanks. It should have bolted when they approached, but it didn't. Erlen stepped closer, his breath misting in front of him. The deer turned its head slowly. Its eyes were not right, not glazed in death, not shining with fear, just blank. And from its mouth, just barely visible in the moonlight, hung a single strand of knotted reed. Jorund crossed himself. It walked here on its own. I watched. From the trees, it didn't stumble. It didn't fight the water. It walked in and stopped, like it was waiting. Erlen whispered, "It is carrying." What? Memory. They left the deer in the river. By morning, it was gone. When Erlen returned home, Halvor was already awake, sitting by the window with his knees drawn to his chest. "I felt it," the boy said, without turning. "She sent it to show me." Erlen approached cautiously. "Are you afraid?" Halvor shook his head. But they're getting heavier." "Who?" Halvor looked down at his hands. "The ones inside. Their names are gone, but their feelings remain. Cold, lost, forgotten." Erlen crouched beside him. "Then we'll name them." Halvor turned. "What?" "We'll name them," Erlen said again, more firmly now. "If they've been carried this long with no one to speak for them, we will give them something to hold on to, something to be remembered by." Halvor blinked. "Even if the names aren't theirs?" Erlen smiled gently. "Even then, memory is not about what is true. It's about what is carried." And so they began. Each night, as the fire crackled and the wind drifted against the longhouse walls, Erlen and Halvor sat together and spoke names into the silence. Names of no one. Names of everyone. Some were sharp, some soft. Some they invented from fragments of old songs or forgotten ancestors. And each time a name was spoken, Halvor seemed a little lighter. The reeds no longer twisted by the doorway. The dreams grew quieter. But Erlen knew the river was not finished. It had never asked for repayment. And it never gave without remembering the shape of what was owed. Snowmelt traced the low paths between longhouse and stable, drawing fine silvery lines through the frost-hardened soil. Spring had not yet truly arrived, but the air no longer bit so sharply. The river flowed now with more confidence, shedding the stiffness of ice, stretching like a creature waking from long sleep. Inside Erlen's home, the fire was lit earlier than usual. Not for warmth, but for company. The silence had grown thick these past days, less from sorrow than from the strange weight that hung between father and son, a hush that deepened every time they named the forgotten. Halvor had become more quiet, though not withdrawn. He moved with a stillness that was new to him. No longer the restless steps of youth eager to outrun his own shadow. Now he walked as if measuring the world with each footfall, as though every tree and stone might whisper something meant for his ears alone. They had spoken over 100 names into the fire, some with reverence, some with nothing but sound and breath. And every name carried away by the flame felt like a thread snipped from the knot that bound him. But Erlen had begun to notice something else. Each time they spoke a name, Halvor slept longer. He rose later, moved slower, and when he did speak, it was often not of the village, or of fishing, or any dream a boy his age might have. Instead, he would mutter questions that belonged to no one. Do you think the river has a beginning? Can stones remember the faces of those who sat on them? Where do voices go when the mouths that spoke them are gone? Erlend answered when he could. But more often, he listened. And sometimes, he wrote the questions down on scraps of bark or old parchment, not for wisdom, but so they would not vanish, as though giving them form might anchor his son to the world above water. One morning, Erlend woke before the first frost had lifted and found Halvor gone. The hearth was still warm. Outside, mist rolled in from the river, thicker than it had been in weeks. He followed the faint, dew-wet prints through the grove of ash trees and down the narrow path that veered away from the worn trail most villagers took. It led, predictably, to the river's edge. But Halvor did not stand at the bank. He was in the water, knee-deep, unmoving. Erlend called out, but his voice was swallowed by the fog. He moved quickly, carefully, over slick stones and frost-slick grass, stopping only when he stood just behind his son. Halvor. The boy didn't turn. Erlend placed a hand on his shoulder. It was cold. What are you doing? Halvor's voice came softly. They stopped speaking last night. Erlend tightened his grip. That's a good thing, isn't it? Halvor shook his head slowly. Number. They're not gone. They're waiting. For what? The boy finally turned, and in his hands he held something Erlend had not seen before. A bundle of reeds, knotted so finely they resembled braids of hair. Each thread had been dipped in ash, turning the ends black. I dreamed of her again, Halvor whispered. She said the ones we named. They have nowhere to go now. The names gave them shape, but not rest. Erlend stared at the bundle. Then what do they want? Halvor hesitated. A place. That evening, Erlend spoke with the village elders, something he had not done since returning with Halvor. He stood in the meeting circle beneath the large yew tree, where judgments were passed and marriages spoken. They need a cairn, he said simply. The elders shifted uncomfortably. Who does? Asked old Brynjar, the fish weigher, his fingers stained perpetually with brine. The ones the river remembers. Murmurs rippled through the circle. We don't honor spirits we can't name, another muttered. But we have named them, Erlend replied. And now they linger. One of the women, Astrid, who still tended the old ways, tilted her head. You want to raise stones for strangers? For the dead with no graves? For the dead that cling to the living, Erlend answered. A pause. Then she nodded. Then let it be done, if only to keep the river still. So they began. Not all the villagers helped. Some watched from doorways, with the suspicion men hold toward things half-remembered and best forgotten. But enough came. Enough understood. They gathered stones from the river's edge, not too large, not too polished, stones that bore the wear of water, stones that had already listened. The cairn was built on the rise overlooking Skarnelven, just beyond the frost line, where the ground no longer wept beneath one's feet. Each stone was placed with a name, not the real names, those were gone, but names given with care, names that felt worn in the mouth. Erlend spoke them aloud as he placed each stone. Thora, who never grew old. Yannick, who walked too far. Anal, who kept silence until the end. When it was done, Halvor approached with the bundle of reeds. He knelt, pressed them into the crook between two stones, and whispered something no one else could hear. The wind shifted, and for the first time in weeks, the air felt empty, not hollow, just unburdened. The weight had lifted. That night, Halvor slept deeply. So did Erland. No whispers, no patterns, no names pressing at the edges of thought. But in the middle of the night, Erland woke to a sound he had not heard in some time. The river, flowing. Simple, peaceful. No groaning, no sudden silence. Just water, moving the way it was meant to. He walked to the doorway, cloak over his shoulders, and listened. And in the hush of that midnight hour, a question formed gently in his mind. One not from the river, nor from Halvor, but from within. How many burdens do we carry because no one thought to name them? And when we do, where do they go? The days that followed were quiet in a way that felt earned. The river no longer murmured strange patterns or drew mist at odd hours. The air moved gently across the village without curling sharply around corners or slipping in through the cracks like a breath held too long. Even the dogs, who had taken to barking nervously at night, now slept without pacing. Halvor rose early again, not with the eager brightness of a child, but with a calm steadiness that Erland found unfamiliar yet comforting. There was still something distant in his gaze at times, as if he were watching not just what lay before him, but also what once had passed. Yet he spoke more easily now, laughed once, quietly, but still, it was laughter. They had begun carving symbols into the cairn, not runes exactly. The Volva's warning still echoed in Erland's memory. To carve the river's truth is to invite it again. But what they made were more like marks of gratitude, simple lines and curves that resembled the knots Halvor had once drawn in his sleep. Each one is a thread, Halvor explained. A reminder, not to summon, but not to forget. They used charcoal and blunt bone knives, no iron. The river disliked iron. That much was always agreed upon. It was during one such morning at the cairn that a stranger came. She arrived on foot, her cloak ragged at the hem and stained with wet ash. Her boots were wrapped in strips of worn cloth, and her hair was a long, tangled braid the color of old wheat. She said little when she reached the edge of the cairn, only stood there, gaze fixed not on the stones, but on Halvor. Erland stepped forward, uncertain. "You've come far?" The woman nodded once. "Do you seek something?" he asked. Her voice was low, a little hoarse. "I heard the names." Erland frowned. "From whom?" She didn't answer immediately. Then with great care she said, "From the water." Halvor turned. His face remained calm, but his posture shifted slightly. His shoulders drew in, not from fear, more like memory brushing skin. The woman moved closer. "You carry them, don't you?" Halvor met her eyes. "Not anymore." The woman knelt at the edge of the cairn, her fingers brushing a stone marked with a crescent-shaped knot. She inhaled slowly, and for a moment Erland thought she might weep. But instead, she spoke a name, one they had never carved. "Njora," she said. Halvor blinked. "That name, it was in the reeds." The woman nodded. "She was my sister." No one spoke for a while after that. The woman did not explain how her sister had been lost to the river, or when, or what had happened. She simply remained with them as the sun rose higher, helping to mark more stones, tying bits of pale thread around the base of the cairn, weaving small knots that seemed to hum softly when the wind passed through. By dusk, she had left again, walking the same path she came on. Afterward, Halvor looked to his father and said, "They're finding us." Erland nodded slowly. "They will come." And come they did, not all at once, not in crowds. But over the weeks, others arrived, quiet figures, most on foot, some with little more than a walking stick and a pouch of dried root. They asked no shelter, demanded no food. They stood at the cairn, spoke names, placed objects, pebbles, feathers, bits of carved bone. And then they left. Erlend began keeping a small ledger, not of visitors, but of the names spoken. His script was rough, his letters uneven, but he pressed each one into the parchment with care, not for record, for remembrance. And Halvor? He changed. Not in the ways Erlend had feared. He grew taller, stronger. His voice deepened. But more than that, he became quieter in a different way, a kind of stillness that felt steady. He no longer woke with strange dreams, no longer murmured in sleep, but he had not forgotten. They're quieter now, he told Erlend one evening, as they sat beside the hearth, but they're still here. Erlend stirred the embers with a stick. In you? Halvor shook his head. Around. In the reeds. In the water. I think the cairn helped them breathe. Erlend raised an eyebrow. Breathe? Halvor looked thoughtful. Memory is like air, isn't it? If you trap it too long, it turns stale. But let it move. Let it pass through things. It changes, becomes part of everything else. Erlend didn't answer. Instead, he added a small log to the fire, and they sat for a long while in the comfortable hush. Have you ever watched someone grow into silence, not out of fear, but out of understanding? The villagers no longer whispered about Halvor. In time, they began sending him questions. Small things at first. A child lost a ring near the river. A goat refused to drink from the stream behind the mill. Then deeper things, dreams, unexplained sorrows, an unease that lingered after someone passed in the night. Halvor never claimed to be a seer, but he listened. And when he listened, he always gave them something in return. A word, a bundle of herbs, a small knot tied into wool, or sometimes just a name that had not been said aloud in years. He never asked for anything in return. He simply carried. One morning, Erlend woke before dawn. He had begun rising earlier now, his bones creaking louder than they used to, his joints stiff with sleep. He poured himself a cup of warm water and stepped outside. There, beside the cairn, stood Halvor. He wasn't carving, or speaking, or kneeling. He was simply standing, arms at his sides, watching the river. Erlend joined him without speaking. They stood like that until the sun crested the eastern hills. Then Halvor turned and said, "She's quieter now." "The woman in the river?" Halvor nodded. "I think she's resting, or maybe listening." "To what?" Halvor looked down at the path, worn now with footprints of those who had come and gone. "To the ones who still remember." Erlend placed a hand on his son's back. Not as a question, not as a comfort, just there. And in that moment, the river behind them flowed with a sound that was utterly ordinary. No whispers, no groans. Just the soft, constant hush of moving water. The kind that lets you sleep peacefully. The kind that lets memory flow. Not to drown you, but to carry you gently home. Mist curled along the water's edge as if reluctant to leave. It clung to the roots of alder trees and drifted lazily over moss-laced stones, lifting only when touched by the sun's slow warmth. On such mornings, the river no longer felt watchful. It simply was. Flowing, winding, reflecting sky and branch alike without judgment, like a mirror too old to hold memories of its own. Halvor stood knee-deep in the current. The cold did not trouble him. He'd grown used to the feel of the river pressing against his skin, the way it tugged gently at his calves as if in greeting. It no longer pulled him under. It no longer whispered names that didn't belong to him. It merely moved past him, like a friend passing close enough to be known, but not close enough to linger. Erlen watched from the bank, his hands resting on the haft of a shovel. Beside him lay a bundle of dry alder branches and a flat stone wrapped in wool. They were building another cairn, not as large as the first, smaller, more personal. This one was for no one the river had taken, and yet it was not empty of meaning. "It's strange," Halvor said without turning, "how quiet it feels now that they're gone." Erlen nodded. "Is it a good quiet?" Halvor hesitated. "Not good or bad, just hollow." He stepped out of the water, careful over the slick stones, and joined his father on the muddy embankment. Erland handed him a dry cloth, and together they wiped the river from his legs. It had been nearly a full season since the last visitor came to the cairn. The ledger sat untouched for weeks now, its pages no longer inked with unfamiliar names or tokens pressed between parchment folds. Most of the reeds that once grew thick near the bend had thinned. Not dead, just sparser, as if no longer needed in such great number. Even the birds had returned to their usual patterns. Still, Erlen found himself uneasy, as though something had been paused, not ended. That afternoon, they built the new cairn in silence, a ring of smooth stones, low to the ground, with a single flat slab placed upright in the center. Halvor traced one of his familiar knot shapes across it with river clay, then set a pale reed in the middle. No thread, no ash, just a reed, simple, unbound. When they were finished, they sat back against a fallen tree. "You haven't dreamed since we finished the last name," Erlen said. Halvor shook his head. "Number. But I feel them sometimes. Not like before. It's more like echoes." "Of what?" "They're leaving." The wind moved through the tall grass, sending it into slow, swaying dance. "Do you think they'll return?" Erlen asked. Halvor turned his head. "Not the same ones, but others might. One day." Erlen sighed. "Then we'll be ready." They spent that evening walking the forest edge, gathering fallen pine cones and checking the traps set earlier in the week. Their boots sank gently into softened paths, and the smell of damp earth hung in the air. The world had returned to itself, but they had not quite. Erlen felt it most in the way he noticed things now. How he looked at the river no longer with suspicion, but with a kind of wary tenderness, like one might regard an old friend who once held a knife but chose not to use it. Or how he watched Halvor speak with the other villagers, always kind, always listening, but never quite in the conversation, as though he were slightly elsewhere, one foot still anchored to a place few could see. "Will you stay here?" Erlen asked him that night, as they sat by the hearth, warm broth in their bowls. Halvor stirred his spoon. "For now." "You could leave," Erlen said quietly. "Find another village, another river." Halvor looked up, eyes catching the light. "They'd follow me." "Even now?" "Not them, but others. The river doesn't only run here, it remembers elsewhere too." Erlen nodded, though he felt something heavy behind the thought. "And you?" Halvor asked. "What about me? Will you stay?" Erlen chuckled softly. "At my age, it's too late to start again." Halvor smiled faintly. "It's never too late, just a little harder." They sat for a time without speaking. The fire snapped and hissed. The scent of juniper drifted from the kindling, mingling with the stew's warmth and the faint perfume of old herbs still hanging from the rafters. Later that night, Erlen woke to a sound he hadn't heard in moons, a soft creaking, not from the house, from the river. He rose, pulled on his cloak, and stepped outside. The moon hung low, veiled in thin clouds. The air was still, not cold, but not warm either, the sort of stillness that usually came before weather. At the edge of the river, near the cairn, he saw Halvor. But Halvor was not alone. A figure stood beside him. Or perhaps it wasn't standing. It hovered, or waited. It had no outline Erland could be sure of, just a gathering of presence, like fog given will. Erland did not call out. He stood in the shadows, watching. Halvor was speaking, but not in words, not aloud. And the figure, it listened. After a time, it turned toward the cairn. Then it was gone. Halvor remained a while longer before returning to the house. Erland met him at the door, but said nothing, only held it open. In the morning, Halvor brewed tea and set 2 cups on the table. He looked tired, but at peace. It wasn't one of them, he said. Erland nodded. No? Number not one we named, not one from the river. Then what? Halvor considered. Maybe a warning. Erland took a sip of the tea. What sort of warning? Halvor leaned forward, elbows on the table. That the silence isn't empty. It's waiting. Erland felt the weight of the words settle into the room like ash from a fire long burned. And beneath their feet, far below the earth and roots and stone, the river moved still. Not in malice, not in hunger, just in memory. By the time the frost fully retreated and green returned to the hills, the cairn on the riverbank had grown into a small garden, not of flowers, those had not yet begun to bloom, but of offerings, smooth pebbles marked by children, pieces of carved driftwood tied with faded twine. Even a pair of old boots, soles worn clean by years of walking, placed carefully beneath the largest stone, as though the river might one day decide to wear them. The villagers had stopped asking what the cairn was for. They didn't need to anymore. They came in silence, sat for a while, and left lighter. Some stayed longer. Others returned often. But no one asked questions now, not out loud. It was early one morning, just as the mist began to rise again from the bend where the water deepened, that Halvor heard it, something different. Not the river itself, which had returned to its rhythm of soft flowing, but beneath it, a pulse, not a sound exactly, more like a sensation. A slow, steady beat, like a drum held underwater. It echoed in his chest, faint and deep. Erland found him that morning sitting beside the cairn, his feet bare, eyes closed. Did they return? He asked quietly. Halvor shook his head. Number this is something else. Erland sat beside him, careful not to disturb the stillness. Tell me. Halvor opened his eyes. I think there are deeper places in the river. Ones we've never walked near, not even in thought. Places beneath the bend? Beneath memory. Erland nodded slowly. And you feel them now? Yes, I think they're waking. They sat in silence a while longer, and the sound, or the sense of it, faded like a dream too distant to follow. But it had left something behind, a shadow that did not darken the world, but stretched across it. That day, Halvor did not eat. He walked the woods instead, stopping often to kneel beside tree roots, sometimes whispering, sometimes listening. When he returned, he held something in his hand, a stone, round and pale, with a hole worn clean through its center. A seeing stone, he said simply, and placed it at the base of the smaller cairn. Erland watched him. What do you hope to see? Not hope, Halvor said. Prepare. That evening, the vulva returned. Not the same one from the Iron Hills. This one was younger, wrapped in a cloak of undyed wool, her hair cut short like a servant's. But her eyes were old. She carried no staff. Only a small bag of herbs and a gnarled piece of bone, polished smooth by time and touch. She did not knock. She walked into their longhouse just after dusk, knelt beside the hearth, and said, "You've stirred something." Erland bowed his head. "We buried the names." The woman looked to Halvor. "Not all of them." Halvor tilted his head. "They didn't all want burying." She nodded. "Some rivers lead to the sea, others lead down." She reached into her bag and pulled out a bundle of dried leaves, each veined like cracked ice. "You'll need these soon," she said, and pressed them into Halvor's hand. "What are they?" "Memory softeners," she replied, "to ease the edge when it cuts too deep." Erland frowned. "Will it come to that?" She did not answer. Instead, she placed the piece of bone on the hearth. It was carved with a spiral, one that looped not outward, but inward, tighter and tighter until it disappeared into itself. "This is the path inward," she said, "when the surface no longer reflects what lies beneath." Halvor touched it lightly. "What's down there?" The woman looked at him, her voice quieter than before. "The things even the river forgot." She stayed only one night. Before dawn, she had gone. Erland found her footprints leading into the forest, but they ended before the first ridge. After that, the dreams returned. Not the voices, not the names, just water, rising, filling the longhouse, washing over the hearth, slipping into the corners of the floor, the folds of the blanket, the spaces between breath and word. Erland woke gasping. Halvor sat beside him, already awake, already knowing. "They're not memories," he said. "They're warnings." They began building a third cairn. This one not at the river's edge, but on higher ground, above the frost line where the lichen clung tight to stone, and the air held the dryness of age. They carved no names here, only patterns, knots that bent inward, loops that led to nowhere, circles broken and mended again, and at its center they placed a bowl. Stone, shallow, smooth, filled with river water. Each morning, Halvor changed it, not because it grew dirty, but because it clouded, softly, faintly, like breath on glass. Something was beginning to rise. The villagers didn't ask, but they watched. And Erland, now growing slower in his limbs, felt the weight settle in his spine again. Have you ever felt it? That slow tension in the world, as if something were winding tighter and tighter with each breath. Not in fear, but in certainty. One evening, Halvor stood by the bowl and said, "The water is remembering." Erland joined him. "What does it remember now?" Halvor did not answer, but the surface of the water shifted. Not stirred, shifted, as if something inside had turned. And at the bottom, they saw it, just for a moment, a reflection that was not theirs, a face not of flesh, but of pattern, braided reeds for hair, stone for eyes, lips sealed with thread. It looked up at them without blinking. Then it was gone. Halvor exhaled slowly. "She's coming back." Erland's throat felt dry. "The woman?" Halvor shook his head. "The river." And as night fell over the hills, the old rhythm began again. Not loud, not rushing, just steady. A pulse beneath the stones, a memory in motion, a thread tugged softly from the deep. The following days unfolded like cloth unraveling slowly, thread by thread, unseen until it lay in coils at one's feet. The weather held its peace, and no storms rose. Birds returned to the branches, and bees began nosing about the flowering herbs near the longhouse door. Yet beneath the calm, Erland felt a shifting, not in the wind, not in the sky, but in the hush between moments, like a drumbeat far off, so faint it could be mistaken for one's own heart. The bowl at the third cairn now clouded more quickly, even when the water was fresh. It no longer settled clear. Even when left untouched, the surface shimmered with a thin film, like breath exhaled from beneath. Halvor visited it each morning and each evening, replacing the water without question. His movements were deliberate, slow, not from weariness, but ritual, as if he had begun listening to something deeper than words. One morning, Erland approached quietly and asked, "What do you see?" Halvor looked down at the bowl, eyes steady. "I don't see it," he murmured. "I feel it." Erland crouched beside him. "What does it feel like?" Halvor paused, thoughtful. "Like the moment just before sleep, when your body forgets where it ends, when everything softens, but you're still falling." Erland didn't speak. The words settled heavily in his chest. They tended to the cairn in silence, smoothing stones, brushing moss from crevices. But as the days passed, others began to visit. Not many. Only those who had been closest to the river in years past. Men who had fished its bends since boyhood. Women who had gathered its reeds and buried stillborn lambs near its shallows, wrapped in flax and prayer. They came with quiet questions in their eyes. Erland answered with gestures. A nod, a hand to the cairn, an invitation to sit. Halvor, on the other hand, began to speak less. He would sit beside the third cairn, legs folded, hands resting open in his lap, as if waiting not for a visitor, but for something from within. Children started calling him Flodbarn, Riverborn. At first in whispers, then more openly. The name was not cruel. It held no mockery. It was merely the only word they could find for what he had become. Have you ever watched someone become something slowly? Not by force, but by surrender? Not a giving up, a giving over. One night, as the fire dimmed and the wind pressed gently against the longhouse, Halvor turned to Erland and said, "I think I know her name." Erland stiffened. "Whose?" "The one in the water." They had not spoken of her in many moons, not since the last face in the bowl. "I don't mean her old name," Halvor continued. "Not the one she had when she lived. I mean the name she became." Erland set his carving knife down. "And what is it?" Halvor's voice dropped low. "Vitra." He said it without weight, as if placing a pebble into an already full hand. "Vitra," Erland echoed, tasting the sound. "Does it mean something?" Halvor's gaze drifted to the door. "I think it means stillness after breath, not death, not sleep, just the space between." The word remained in the air long after they stopped speaking. That night, Erland dreamed of the river, but not as it was. In the dream, it had no banks, no shore, only water stretching in all directions, glass still, and at the center, standing barefoot atop the surface, was a figure, hair like reeds, arms stretched wide, eyes closed. Vetra. She did not speak. She simply opened her palms, and something, threads, bones, wind, unraveled from her fingers and floated outward, sinking into the water. When Erland awoke, the name still echoed in his mind. That morning, he found Halvor already outside, seated before the third cairn. "She spoke to me," Erland said softly. Halvor did not look away from the bowl. "She's gathering." "Gathering what?" Halvor's voice was quiet. "Those who remember too much, and those who carry without knowing." Erland felt a shiver pass through him. To what end? "I don't know yet, but the water is tightening." And indeed, the river had changed. Not visibly. It still ran smoothly between the trees, still reflected the sky, still lapped against the stones with a gentleness that seemed eternal. But animals no longer drank from it, not even the dogs, and the reeds, those that had regrown, began to twist of their own accord, not into knots, but spirals, tight, inward curving spirals, just like the carving the second vulva had left behind. Erlend brought the carved bone to Halvor. The boy studied it for a long moment, then nodded. "It's her mark," he said. "Then she's returning?" Halvor didn't answer. That evening, a child went missing. A girl named Sina, no more than 5 winters old. She had been playing with a wooden spoon and a bowl near the stream that fed into Skarnelven. Her footprints led to the edge of the water. They did not return. The village searched through dusk, called into the trees, lit torches, beat the reeds with sticks. But there was no sign, and no sound from the river, just stillness. Erlend stood beside the others, his heart pounding, hands gripping the haft of his axe, though he knew it would do no good. And then Halvor stepped forward. He wore no boots, no cloak, just his tunic and a quiet on his face that sent a hush through the gathered crowd. "I'll find her," he said. They did not stop him. He walked alone down the slope and waded into the water. The mist rolled in almost immediately, curling low over the banks, covering his shape until only the ripple of his steps remained. They waited. 1 hour passed, then 2. And then, from the mist, came the sound of a child's voice, software laughing, then the splash of feet. And out from the fog came Halvor, carrying Sina. She was dry, as if she'd never touched the water. She clutched a reed in one hand and looked sleepy, but unafraid. "She followed the song," Halvor explained as he laid her into her mother's arms. "What song?" someone asked. Halvor looked to the river, one only the forgotten can hear. Erlend stood beside him as the crowd murmured, scattered, pulled back toward their homes. He looked at Halvor, then to the river, and it struck him, for the first time in many moons, the river was waiting, not for sacrifice, not for tribute, but for return, not of people, of something else, of memory. The stars held their breath that night. No clouds drifted across the sky, no owls called from the dark, and even the wind, the ever-present wind, chose silence. Skarnelven ran smooth and dark beneath the starlight, not murmuring as it once had, but gliding, as if afraid to disturb something sleeping in its depths. In the longhouse, Erlend sat alone. Halvor was outside still, seated by the third cairn. He had not spoken since returning Sina to her mother. There was a stillness about him now that went beyond quiet. It was a kind of suspension, as though something inside him hovered between states, not yet flesh, not yet memory. Erlend poured water into a cup and set it before the fire. He did not drink it. He simply watched the steam curl upward, remembering a time before reeds, before silence, before the river had taken his son and given him back. Changed. Have you ever held on to someone you love, even when you're no longer certain they are wholly themselves? It's not always sorrow that fills the space between knowing and not knowing. Sometimes it's awe. The door creaked open behind him, and Halvor entered. His feet were bare. His hands were wet. In one of them, he held something tightly closed. "She left this," he said softly. He opened his palm. Inside lay a small object, smooth, pale, oval, like a river stone, but warm to the touch. It was not made of stone, nor bone, nor clay. Erlend leaned closer. It was wax molded into the shape of an eye, with a single slit carved through the center, like a thread-pulled wound. "She placed it in the water before Sina could reach it," Halvor said. "I saw her do it." Erlend reached out, but Halvor closed his hand protectively. It's not for touching. What is it? Erlend asked. Halvor stared at it. A warning. Or a memory sealed. I think it's both. He set it on a strip of cloth near the hearth carefully. Then he looked up, eyes distant but not empty. She's not angry, he said. Vetra, that's not why she returns. Erlend kept his voice low. Then why? Halvor answered without hesitation. Because the world is forgetting. Erlend blinked. Forgetting what? Halvor turned toward the fire. That every silence once had a voice. The flame popped gently, sending a soft spray of sparks upward. Outside, the river whispered, not with words, but with a motion, like breath, held too long. It lapped once against the bank, then stilled. That night, Halvor did not sleep. Erlend woke near dawn and found him gone. Again. He followed the path past the lower grove, beyond the first cairn, and finally, beyond even the bend in the river, where no one ever walked. Not since the early days of the village, when a man had vanished on a bet and was never found again. Erlend found him standing near a shallow pool where the river slowed. The water was thick here, not dirty, but dense, as if it carried something more than silt and stone. Halvor did not turn when Erlend approached. She left a message here, he said softly. Long ago. Erlend stepped beside him. How do you know? Because it's waking? The pool pulsed, just once. A ripple moved from center to shore, though no wind stirred. Halvor knelt. I don't think she meant to be forgotten, he said. I don't think she ever asked to be worshipped either. Erlend crouched beside him. Then what did she want? Halvor tilted his head. A place to rest. A place to keep the names. The ripple came again, and this time something surfaced. Not a body, not a hand, but a shape. Flat, carved, pale. It floated to the edge of the pool and stopped at Halvor's knees. He reached into the water and lifted it. A piece of driftwood, knotted with thread. But this time, the knot was not inward. It looped outward. A spiral that opened like a flower. Erlend felt his breath catch. He had seen that pattern once, long ago, on the birth cloth of his wife, when she delivered Halvor in the spring of a year marked by smoke and sorrow. It had been a good luck sign, meant to invite new life. Halvor cradled the wood in both hands. She's giving something back, he said. What? I don't know yet. They brought it back to the third cairn and placed it beside the bowl. The water inside, still cloudy from the day before, began to settle the moment the wood was near. And then, without breeze, without hand, the bowl tipped slightly and stilled. The water did not spill. It simply balanced. And for the first time, Erlend felt something not from the river, not from Halvor, but from the air itself. Relief. That night, Halvor did sleep, and he dreamed of a woman walking through a forest where no trees grew, only reeds. Thousands of them, taller than houses. They swayed, but did not bend. And in her arms, she carried a bundle, wrapped in threads the color of breath. She reached a circle of water, and she whispered a name into it. He could not hear the name, but he felt its weight. When he woke, his hands smelled faintly of wax and salt. Erlend was already awake, boiling barley and fish. He turned as Halvor stirred. She left a message for you, he said. Halvor blinked. Who? Erlend reached into the folds of his cloak and drew out a piece of cloth. Wrapped inside it was a single reed, knotted at both ends. Found it on the windowsill, before sunrise, Erlend said. Halvor held it gently. I think she's saying goodbye. Erlend nodded. Or thank you. Halvor smiled. For the first time in many seasons, it was the smile of a boy. And outside, the river flowed, free, quiet, and without memory, but not forgotten. By midsummer, the river had changed again. It no longer whispered, no longer held the weight of watchers unseen, nor did it draw the wary glances of elders tending goats or mothers sending children for water. It had, in the truest sense, returned to itself. There were days now when Erlen stood by the cairn and could almost believe that none of it had happened. No knots, no names, no eyes in the water or pale threads tangled in sleep. And yet, that too was memory, a different kind. It had not vanished. It had settled, somewhere beneath the surface of things. The cairn still stood, the first, now moss-covered and softened with time, visited by the quiet-hearted. The second, smaller and more intimate, remained untouched except by Halvor's hand. And the third, the one they called the listening stone, remained the most mysterious. Children left pebbles there. Travelers sometimes brought feathers or folded leaves, and always the bowl remained, never emptied now, and never full. Halvor had begun making maps, not with ink and quill, but with thread. Loops and spirals knotted into squares of cloth, soaked in river water and dried in the sun. He never explained them, and Erlen did not ask. But he watched, noting the way Halvor's fingers moved with confidence, as though each knot was not a guess, but a memory waiting to be remembered again. One afternoon, as the sky pressed close and a storm threatened over the ridge, Erlen found Halvor sitting beneath the oldest pine, laying one of his maps across his knees. "This one's different," Erlen said gently, crouching beside him. Halvor nodded. "It's not a place." Erlen raised an eyebrow. "Then what?" Halvor didn't answer immediately. He ran a thumb along one of the threads. "It's a time." Erlen sat back. "When?" Halvor looked up toward the clouds. "Soon." That night, thunder rolled far off, never arriving, only rumbling like a distant drum that refused to approach. Erlen lay awake, listening. He half expected the river to begin again, to churn, to hum, to rise. But it didn't. Instead, something stranger happened. It stopped. He rose before dawn and stepped outside. The trees were still, the birds silent, and Skarnoven no longer moved. Not frozen, not dry, just still. The surface was flat, like glass blown wide across the valley. Even the insects didn't skim it. Erlen called for Halvor. No answer. He walked to the longhouse door. Open. Inside, the bedding was undisturbed. But the window, the small, round one Halvor had once carved with a reed motif, was open. He found the first thread there, tied to the sill, looped in a pattern Erlen did not recognize. Another hung from the tree near the first cairn. Then another from the post at the goat pen. Each one tight, purposeful, silent. He followed them, one after another, until they led him beyond the cairns, beyond the grove, to the edge of the river's oldest bend. There, on a flat stone worn by centuries of water and footfall, sat Halvor. Still, eyes open, hands resting on his knees. He was breathing, but he did not blink. The air felt thick, like cloth soaked in memory. Erlen sat beside him slowly, uncertain whether to speak. He didn't need to. Halvor spoke first. "She's leaving." Erlen looked around. "Now?" Halvor nodded. Not far, but deep. They sat in silence. "What do you mean she's leaving?" Erlen asked. Halvor's voice was soft. "The river can't hold her anymore. She's untying herself." Erlen stared at the still surface. "Will she take you?" Halvor smiled, faint and far away. "Number. But she'll leave something." The river shivered. Only once. A single ripple passed through the bend, and then it moved again. Slow, steady, soft. alive. Halvor blinked for the first time in minutes. The threads he had tied across the village had all come loose, not snapped, untied. Back at the longhouse, the cloth map on the table had unraveled completely. Not a knot remained, only bare fabric, soft as breath. Erland helped Halvor stand. The boy was light, not weak, just unburdened. She gave it back, Halvor said as they walked home. What? My own silence? In the weeks that followed, no more reeds appeared on the doorstep. No dreams spoke in pattern. No eyes opened beneath the water. And the cairns remained, quiet and untouched. Halvor began teaching the children how to tie the simplest knots, ones that meant nothing and everything. They laughed when they got it wrong and cheered when they made a perfect loop. Erland watched, a cup of warm mead in hand. He felt older now, not in body, though that too, but in soul. He had carried his son into the world once, and once again when he pulled him back from the river. But now he understood something deeper. Halvor had never truly left. He had simply learned to sit beside something the rest of them couldn't see, and to listen without drowning. At night, the river still spoke, but only as rivers do, in lapping water, in frog song, in the hush of stones shifting against current, the way it always had, before the forgetting, before the threads were tangled, before the silence had a name. And in that gentle dark, Erland sometimes whispered to the night, Vetra, not to summon, not to warn, only to remember. By the turning of the leaves, the river no longer bore even a trace of what had once stirred beneath it. Its rhythm had settled into the ordinary, a slow, unhurried winding between the birch roots and moss-covered stones. And the village, too, seemed to breathe easier. The children no longer feared the sound of water after dark. Fishermen returned to the deeper bends, no longer steering wide of certain shores. Women dipped their washing without crossing themselves first. Even the dogs drank freely from the shallows again. Only Erland noticed how quiet Halvor had become. Not withdrawn, not ill, just distant, in the way old trees seem to lean toward the wind, even when there's no breeze. He still worked, still walked the hills, still taught the children their knots. But at dusk, when the last smoke curled from the cook fires and the stars blinked into their places above the longhouse roofs, Halvor often sat alone beside the third cairn, eyes half closed, hands folded loosely in his lap. And there were moments, brief, almost invisible, when Erland would catch the boy staring not at the water, but through it, as if seeing not reflections, but memories suspended just beyond reach. Have you ever seen someone look at silence and recognize it as something they've known longer than they've known you? One morning, a mist arrived, not the heavy river fog of old, but a delicate veil, woven thin across the grass and trees. Erland stepped outside and found Halvor already at the third cairn, seated cross-legged, the wax eye left by Vetra resting in his open palm. She's gone, Halvor said softly. Erland crouched beside him. Are you sure? Halvor didn't answer immediately. Then, yes. She's not below anymore. The bowl at the center of the cairn, long untouched, had emptied overnight. Not spilled, emptied, dry and pale as bone. Halvor placed the wax eye inside and stood. Erland felt a faint tension in his chest, like a bowstring loosening after long strain. What does it mean? He asked. Halvor looked toward the river. That she's let go. That evening, they gathered the village. Not with drums or bells or loud words, but with firelight and food, the kind of gathering that begins with a quiet ripple of motion and ends with nearly every soul seated in a wide circle beneath the stars. They brought bread and smoked fish, mead and cider, even a stew rich with root vegetables and herbs from Anja's garden. No one spoke at first. They simply shared space. Halvor sat at the center of the circle, not as leader or prophet, but as a kind of hinge, the point where every gaze eventually landed and then moved on. When the fire settled into a slow, breathing glow, he stood. "There's nothing more to carry," he said simply. The words were plain, but they landed with weight. He went on, "What came through me is no longer in me. It is gone where we cannot follow, and that is a kind of peace." A silence followed, not heavy, but reverent. Halvor let it rest before speaking again. But the memory remains, and memory is our part. He looked around the firelight. "I will not be here forever." A murmur. Erlend tensed. "But I am here now, and I will teach you how to listen." No one asked for more. They didn't need to. From that night on, a new rhythm formed. Halvor began weaving his maps again, not of thread, but of song. Soft melodies hummed as he walked, each note drawn out as if tied to something unseen. He sang while gathering reeds, while carving wood, while placing stones. The children followed him, repeating his tones until their voices overlapped in harmony like layered water. One by one, he taught them to listen to the world as if it were a story still being spoken. They learned to hear the breeze in the leaves not as noise, but as breath. To feel the dampness of soil not as mess, but as memory. To understand that the river didn't need to speak anymore, because everything it had carried was already here, stitched into the grass, the trees, their names. Erlend grew older. His joints stiffened in the cold, and his steps slowed. But his hands never forgot the patterns. He carved them still, into bits of birch bark, into smooth stones, into the beams of the longhouse. He never carved Vetra's name, but he never forgot it. One night, as autumn stretched toward its close, and the chill began curling back beneath the doors, Halvor entered the longhouse carrying a bundle wrapped in dark linen. Erlend looked up from his seat by the fire. Halvor sat across from him and gently unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a single reed, twisted into a spiral that opened outward, just like the one she had once left behind. But this one was green, alive, still moist from where it had grown. "She gave it to me," Halvor said. Erlend frowned. "I thought she had gone." "She has," Halvor replied, "but her memory hasn't." He set the spiral on the hearthstone. "I think it's time to plant it." They did so the next morning, not by the river, but on the hill above the third cairn. A patch of soil was cleared and softened. The reed was pressed gently into place, and around it they placed 7 small stones, each with a knot carved on its face, each representing a name never spoken again. By spring, the spiral had grown taller. By summer, it had multiplied. A small ring of reeds, unlike any found near the water, now stood at the hill's crest, swaying in windless air. No one disturbed them, not even the children. They came, yes, sat nearby, listened to the hush of their rustling, but they never touched. Somehow, they knew. Years passed. Halvor aged slowly, as if the river still flowed within him. His hair turned the color of old ash, and lines gathered gently at the corners of his eyes. But his voice never lost its steadiness. One day, he called Erlend to the cairn and placed a folded cloth in his hands. It was warm. Inside, 3 spiraled knots, each different. One for what was carried, one for what was released, and one for what was still unknown. Erlend looked up. Halvor smiled. "I'm not going far." The next morning, he was gone. No footprints, no farewell, just the cloth on the table and the reed hill quietly stirring in the breeze. The river flowed still, not louder, not stranger, just deeper. And Erland? He stood each morning by the cairn, not in mourning, but in remembering. Because some things are not meant to be explained, only honored. Some silences are not absences, they are offerings. And in the hush, where the water once spoke, there now remained only one thing: peace. The seasons folded over one another like pages gently turned, and as they passed, the village lived, not in fear, not in awe, but in quiet gratitude. The river remained itself, flowing, deep, constant. And though no more faces appeared in its surface, and no more waxen warnings were left on doorsteps, the memory of what had once stirred in its depths was never lost. Erland aged in his own way, not quickly, not with frailty, but with a growing softness, the kind that comes when a man has lived long enough to see the sharp things of youth smoothed by time. He no longer fished, no longer mended nets or chopped wood. Others had taken up those rhythms, but each morning, before the dew lifted, he walked to the third cairn and sat beside the stone bowl. It had not held water since the day Halvor planted the reed, but he sat there anyway. He would sit and hum. Sometimes a melody Halvor had taught the children, sometimes just a tone that came and stayed like the warmth of the rising sun. He didn't need to think. The sound carried him, like a leaf floating on the surface of something vast but gentle. And though Halvor had gone without goodbye, gone without trace, Erland did not grieve him in the way others might, because Halvor had not vanished. He had passed through, and some part of him remained, not just in the reeds, though they grew thick and green now, each spiral like a sigh remembered, not just in the knots tied by every child before they reached 10 winters, not even in the songs they sang at dusk, twining notes around one another like threads. No, Halvor remained in the way they listened. It had taken time, but they all had learned to pause before speaking, to feel before naming, to sit beside silence and ask nothing of it. One day in early spring, as snowmelt turned the ground soft and generous, Erland felt a tug, not at his cloak or his sleeve, but deep within. A quiet pull, not pain, not fear, just invitation. He walked, slowly now, toward the grove beyond the hill. The children called it the Ring of Reed Light, though no one knew where the name had begun. The spiral reeds swayed, though no breeze touched them. He stepped between them, careful not to brush their stalks, and knelt on the mossy earth at the center of the ring. There, buried shallowly beneath soil that had never frozen fully, he placed the cloth Halvor had left him. He untied the knot of the unknown and let it fall open. Inside was nothing, and everything, an empty square, soft as breath, worn by time. There was no magic in the act, no wind that rose, no light that changed, only a stillness that settled, low and warm, as if the land had accepted something it had long been waiting for. Erland sat for a long while, and when he rose again, he did not look back. The years that followed were gentle. The village did not grow large, nor did it dwindle. People came and went, as people do. But something in the rhythm remained unchanged. They told stories, of course, of the boy who returned from the river and taught them how to listen, of the threads that had once carried names too heavy for voices, of Vetra, the silent woman of water, who had once held them all in her gaze and then turned away. But these stories were not told with fire and fear. They were not warnings. They were lullabies, And in that village, no one feared the river at night anymore, because they knew that some rivers do not forget. They do not punish. They do not hunger. They hold. They keep. And sometimes, when the world has forgotten how to listen, they speak. But only to those who listen with the part of themselves that cannot be named. One such listener was a child named Line. She was small, with quiet eyes, and a way of walking that made even the most startled birds stay still on their branches. She liked to sit by the river's edge, with her fingers wrapped around a bit of thread, twisting it slowly into patterns she never seemed to finish. One day, as dusk fell, she sat beside Erland, now white-haired, his hands lined and careful, his gaze steady as stone warmed by sun. She said, "The river told me something." He didn't laugh. He didn't question. He only nodded. "What did it say?" he asked. She considered, her fingers still working. "It said that remembering is like water. You can carry it, but only if you don't try to hold it too tight." He smiled. That night, he carved her first knot into the stone of the third cairn. A simple one, a loop, unclosed, waiting. Time, as it does, moved forward. Erland passed, softly, like a reed falling back into the water that once grew it. There was no great gathering, no loud mourning, only a quiet meal, shared among those who had known him, and a walk down to the cairns. They placed no new stones. They simply sat. And the wind moved through the reeds, not in sorrow, but in song. Some said they heard his voice in the hush between gusts. Others said the river shimmered differently that day, but no one argued, and no one feared, because they knew that Erland had gone where Halvor had gone before him, not away, not beneath, but through. And the village remained. The cairn stood. The thread was passed, from hand to hand, from silence to silence, from memory to memory. Some said the river was sleeping now. Others said it was only waiting for the world to forget again, but none dared to forget it themselves. And in the hush of twilight, when the reeds leaned just so, and the water folded gently around stone, there was a sound that returned. Not a whisper, not a warning, not a name, only a breath, given and received. Spring deepened, and with it came the slow unfurling of everything that had waited in silence through the long frost. The riverbanks softened underfoot, warm with worm paths and green shoots. Bees returned, flitting low to the earth where wildflowers dared open again. And in the middle of the reed ring, the spiral swayed with a rhythm no wind commanded. No one disturbed them. They were part of the land now, neither monument nor mystery, simply a truth grown from memory. And though the people no longer whispered about Halvor, or Vetra, or the day the river stopped, their hands still remembered. Each child, before their 11th spring, was taught not only to fish, or cook, or mend wool, but also to tie the simple loop that spiraled outward. The villagers no longer said why. They no longer needed to. Some truths are not instructions. They are inheritances. Lena, the quiet-eyed girl who once spoke of the river breathing through memory, had grown. She stood now at the edge of the third cairn, taller, stronger, but still and listening. In her hands, she held a length of undyed thread, coiled loosely, the end frayed where she'd unspooled it each morning before dawn. She had begun tying her own knots, not copying those of Halvor or Erland, but patterns she dreamt in the hours between sleep and waking. Her fingers moved with ease, guided not by thought, but by something older and deeper, a sensation that pulsed in her chest like a second heartbeat. The cairn had begun to change, not visibly, not to most, but she noticed. Each morning, one stone would be warm to the touch, while the others remained cool. Another would hold dew longer than its neighbors. A third would hum softly when her hand hovered above it. And once, when she placed a finished knot into the center bowl, the water shimmered, just briefly, like a ripple beneath glass, and then went still again. She said nothing, not because she didn't want to, but because there was nothing to explain. The cairn was speaking again, but not in warning, not in sorrow. It was speaking in presence, in patience, and she was listening. One evening, as the village gathered for the first festival of planting, a small boy approached her, his hands full of broken twine. "My knots won't hold," he said, his voice trembling with the kind of frustration only 5-year-olds know. Lean knelt and took the twine gently. "Sometimes they're not meant to," she said, smiling. "Sometimes the knot is in the trying." He frowned, unconvinced. "Here," she whispered, "let's make one that wants to come undone." And together they tied a knot with a hidden thread. One tug, and it would fall away like wind from a leaf. The boy laughed when it worked. "Again," he said. Laney handed him the twine. "Now you try." Nearby, the fire crackled, the music began, and the people of the river valley danced. But Lane returned to the cairn before the first song ended. She placed a small stone, smooth and blue-gray, on the warmest point of the central bowl. Then she tied a loop, just one, and waited. The next morning, she returned to find the bowl half filled, not with water, with thread, thin, pale, endless. It spilled from the center, uncoiling like a dream that did not end. She reached out, lifted it gently. It was warm. It hummed faintly. And somewhere, far below the earth, beneath the bones of reeds and the hush of roots, the river pulsed once, quiet, grateful, and whole. Lena did not speak of it. Instead, she began to walk, not away, not to leave, but to carry. She tied the thread to her wrist, not tight, not binding, and began her journey along the river's course, winding gently past the edge of the known, into valleys where no cairns yet stood, where no stories had yet been told, where silence had not yet been taught to listen. And as she walked, the thread followed, unspooling behind her like a promise given shape. She left a knot at the base of an old elm whose roots touched the stream. She tied another to a broken fence post beside a cottage where no one had lived in years. She left one in a bird's nest, tucked carefully between reeds that had never spiraled, each one a gesture, not of command, but of remembrance. And slowly the thread stretched behind her, growing longer, softer, stronger with each knot. She did not need a map. She did not need a name. She only needed the rhythm she carried in her chest, the one that began in a longhouse long ago, when a boy returned from the river with reeds in his mouth and silence in his eyes. Lene had never met Halvor, but he had left her the most precious gift of all, a listening that never ends. Back in the village, the bowl in the third cairn sat empty again. But no one filled it, because they knew the thread had moved on, and what it would gather now was not sorrow, not memory, but hope, soft as water, strong as time. Lenie's journey followed no road. She moved like a reed in the current, turning where the river turned, pausing where the land bent low in hush, pressing onward when silence beckoned her forward. The thread, tied to her wrist, trailed behind her without weight, unfurling in perfect rhythm, never tangling, never thinning. Each knot she left behind marked not a place, but a moment, a breath, a sound, a remembering. She did not call what she was doing pilgrimage. She did not call it anything at all, and the land did not question her. The river ran beside her, narrower now, its waters quickening as it traveled northward toward the hills. The banks grew steeper, the stones more jagged, and the trees, tall firs and spruce, began to close in above. It was a wilder place, untouched by village hands, where old things slumbered under lichen and time. On the third night, as stars blinked between pine boughs and the moon cast a gentle silver on the thread behind her, Leni found an abandoned fire circle by the water's edge. She did not light a flame. Instead, she sat on a mossy rock and opened her hands. The thread pulsed softly in her palm, warm and slow. "Here," she whispered, though there was no one to hear. "This is for you." She tied a loop and placed it inside the stone circle. A breath of wind stirred the ashes, and a single coal beneath the dirt sparked once before fading. She slept there, her back to the earth, eyes open to the sky, and dreamed of a place she had never seen, a wide lake with no ripples, a cairn taller than any she had known, and a boy singing to reeds that bloomed in spiral whorls. When she woke, the thread had changed. It now bore faint colors, blue and green, and a soft gray, like fog at dawn, woven as if memory had begun to express itself in shade. She smiled and walked. By midsummer, Leni had crossed through 6 valleys. At the edge of each, she left a knot. Some she tied in trees. Others she placed beneath stones. One she tucked inside the hollow of a bird's skull, wrapped in fern. Each time she did, the thread behind her shimmered faintly, and her own pace grew lighter, as though what she carried was no longer burden, but song. In one village, small and forgotten by most, she found people sitting around a dry well. They watched her approach with guarded eyes. No one smiled. A woman, old and bent like winter's branch, stepped forward and said, "The water here left us long ago." Lena asked nothing. She only walked to the well, unspooled a length of thread, and dropped it inside. A pause, then a sound. Low, like a groan, then drip, then trickle. A wetness rose in the dust. Not a flood, not a miracle, just return. They did not ask her name. She left a knot tied to the well's worn stones and walked on. At night, she spoke aloud to no one. But in her mind, she imagined Erlend still by the hearth, Halvor by the river, and Vetra, yes, Vetra, no longer a shadow in the deep, but a presence in every still pool and gentle eddy. "Did you carry the first silence?" Lena asked the sky one night. "Or were you only its keeper?" The stars, as they often do, offered no answer. Only light, old and patient. But that night, her dreams were filled with the rustle of reeds, not whispering, listening. As the land flattened once more and the river widened, Leni found herself near the edge of the world she had known. Villages here were fewer, the paths were faint, and the thread behind her stretched long, braided by wind and memory, stretching back across the earth like a vein of thought. She came to a place where 3 streams met and refused to mingle. Each curved toward the center, but peeled away again, flowing around a low hill covered in stones. The water circled endlessly, never touching. She sat at the hill's base, thread coiled in her lap. Here, something had been forgotten, not lost, refused. The ground pulsed faintly beneath her, not with threat, with tension, a silence too deep, too long. She listened, waited, then stood and climbed the hill. At the top, she found a shallow basin of rock, empty, dry, cracked with age. No offering had been left here in many, many winters. She knelt, unwound the last of her thread. It barely reached the rim. She held the end in her hand and closed her eyes and spoke. "I do not know your name," she said. "I do not know what was done here or what was broken." She placed the thread in the basin, coiling it gently. "But I will listen, even if no one else does." She tied one final knot. Not closed, not open, just resting. And for the first time in her journey, she wept, not from sorrow, from awe, at the depth of silence and the honor of hearing it. When she stood again, the streams below had begun to slow, not stop, just ease. Like breath held too long now exhaled. She did not stay. She turned and walked back toward the thread behind her. Wherever it led now, she did not know. But she followed, because some paths are not meant to return. They are meant to continue, unbroken, unspooling. Lena's feet were calloused by then, her shoulders browned by sun, and her pack worn thin at the seams. Yet nothing felt heavy. The thread, long since vanished from her wrist, remained inside her now, coiled in breath, in thought, in memory. It had become less a thing she carried and more a way she moved. Each step was a thread, each gaze a knot gently placed. She no longer marked the days or counted the knots behind her. There was no need. The land kept time for her. The river, still following her, though she had long since turned from its banks, wound itself beneath the soil, hidden but present, like a hum beneath the world. At night, it returned to her dreams, not as Vetra, not as face or voice, but as rhythm. A long, low rhythm, like a heart too old to race, too steady to stop. She found herself walking uphill now, across ridgelines where the grass grew silver and dry. The forest had fallen away behind her, and before her stretched only a vast stillness, a plain of pale rock, empty but not lifeless, carved by wind and silence. The sky here felt closer, not vast, but close, as if the stars had drawn near to listen. Leni came to a small outcrop of stone shaped like a basin, shallow, smooth. She knelt and placed her hands inside it. It was warm, not from sun, from remembering. She had never been here before, but her hands knew the shape. This is where the river began, not in water, in stillness. Long before the first stream, the first melt, the first rainfall. This was where the silence gathered itself and began to move, not to speak, but to become. And now, after all the knots, all the steps, all the stories, Lean had returned not to the place the thread had led her, but to where it had once been born. She placed her hands flat upon the stone and whispered, "I have brought the silence back." A wind rose, not fierce, not cold, just present. It moved across her shoulders and tugged gently at her hair. Then it passed through the stone basin and down into the plain beyond. And with it, something shifted. Far across the ridge, the sky began to shimmer, not with storm, with light, a soft bloom, like starlight blooming upward from the ground. Leni stood. She did not smile. She did not cry. She only breathed, and the thread inside her hummed. She walked toward the shimmer. It did not blind. It welcomed. It folded over her like water folds around a hand, not resisting, not trapping, just holding. And as she stepped into that pale light, she remembered everything, not in sequence, not in words, but as feeling. The cold of Skarnelven in spring, the weight of Erlen's hand on her shoulder, the voice of the old woman at the well, the boy with the broken knot, the bowl that never filled, the reed that grew in a place no wind touched, Halvor's silence, Vetra's listening, the quiet beyond language, the hush between names, And then the light thickened, and she stopped walking because there was nowhere further to go. She was inside it now. It was not heaven, not dream. It was simply the stillness after, the place that comes not after death, but after carrying. And there, within it, she sat. She untied the last knot in her memory, the one she had tied in her chest, and let it fall open. And the thread that had no end did not end. It simply returned to the river. Back in the village, far behind the ridgelines and the forgotten stones, a child woke before dawn. He was small, barely 6 winters, with a streak of mud across one cheek and a tooth just lost to a game of sticks. He heard something, not a voice, not a call, just a note. One long, soft note, like a string plucked far away. He rose from his bed, pulled his wool shirt over his head, and padded barefoot across the cold floor. Outside, the village still slept. Even the hearth smoke had not begun to rise. He walked to the third cairn. The bowl was full, not of water, not of thread, but of light. Pale, flickering, quiet as breath. He didn't touch it. He only sat beside it, listened, and began to hum. Not a song he'd learned, a song that remembered him. And far beyond the ridge, where the sky touches the stone and the river runs no more, the silence smiled, because it had been heard, because it had been carried, because it had returned. The boy who hummed beside the cairn was named Jory. He had been born in the winter when the river froze early and the snow came late. A strange season, one that made the old women in the village murmur of unsettled rhythms. Yet Jory had always been a quiet child. Not shy, just tuned to something most didn't notice. He spoke slowly. He stared longer than was polite, and often he would sit with his hand on a stone or a tree as if waiting for it to speak back. That morning, when he found the bowl full of light, he did not run or wake his parents or fetch an elder. He did what he always did. He listened. The light was not bright. It did not gleam. It was a soft, pulsing glow, like embers that never burned, a golden hush resting in the hollow of the stone. It didn't warm the air. It didn't cast shadows, but it pulsed in rhythm with his breath. And when he placed his hand near it, not in it, the air between his palm and the surface felt like stretched thread, vibrating faintly as if memory had learned to sing. He stayed until the sun climbed halfway up the sky. When he finally rose, he did not speak of what he'd seen. But later that day, when he joined the other children in their lessons by the river, he tied his first knot. Not the usual loop. Not the one everyone learned. This one had no pattern the elders recognized. It spiraled outward, then curled back in. It looped through itself twice before falling loose again. When asked what it meant, he only said, "It's for the part of the story we don't know yet." The others didn't argue. They tied it too. In the seasons that followed, the knot began to spread. At first, the weavers tried to make sense of it, studying its shape, wondering if it had a meaning carried from some other village, some older tradition. But none claimed it, none recognized it, and yet it felt familiar, like a song remembered from before birth. It appeared in carved wood, on doorposts, walking sticks, even the corner of the mead house roof beam. Children began braiding it into their hair. Farmers etched it into the handles of their tools. Even the stones near the third cairn began to show it, faint impressions, as though the rain and lichen themselves had begun to learn its shape. The village had no name for the knot, but they called it Lana's pattern, not in reverence, in recognition, because even though no one had seen her in many years, and most of the children had never met her at all. Her story had not disappeared. It had, instead, folded in, become part of the soil, the water, the way the wind passed through the reeds each evening. When a child asked where Leni had gone, the answer was always the same. She followed the thread beyond the last remembering. What that meant was never explained. But the children always nodded, as if it needed no explaining. One late autumn, when the wind sharpened and the geese had already fled, a stranger arrived. He wore dark furs and walked with a staff, and though his shoulders were bent, his eyes were bright. He said little at first, accepted bread and water, slept in the shed behind the goat shelter. But on the second night, he walked to the cairns and sat there long after dark, his breath steaming in slow rhythm. Jory, now older, leaner, quiet still, approached him with a lantern. "You came for the bowl," Jory said. The man nodded. "I heard of the light." Jory sat beside him. "It comes and goes," he said. "Not by moon or season. It's its own thing." The man smiled faintly. "Like her." Jory glanced over. "You knew her?" The man didn't answer. He reached into his cloak and drew out a small object. A reed, perfectly dried, twisted in a single loop that had no beginning, no end. Jory leaned closer. He'd never seen a knot tied so tightly. The man placed it beside the bowl, and the light flared, just once, like a heartbeat. Then it was gone. Knot faded. Gone. The bowl was empty, but something new remained. A faint sound, like threads being drawn through cloth, like a loom at work, somewhere deeper than hearing. Jory breathed in sharply. He looked to the stranger. The man was gone. No footprints, no shadow. Only the reed remained, and the bowl now warm as skin. He picked it up carefully and brought it to the longhouse, placed it beside the hearth, and from that night on, the fire never went out. Even in wind, even in rain, even in sorrow. Over time, the cairn softened with moss. The knots faded in the sun. The reeds that had once spiraled now grew tall and straight again. The river ran on, not as it had before, but not changed either, fulfilled. Some villagers grew old and left. Some children wandered and returned. Some stories turned to song, others to silence, but always, in the quiet moments, one might still hear it. A hum, a pulse, a rhythm beneath the ordinary, not loud, not near, but steady, like a thread pulled gently through time, and always someone would be there to tie the next knot, to carry the silence forward, not as burden, but as belonging. Because some stories do not end. They are not meant to. They only change hands, like bowls passed from fire to fire, like light folded back into breath. The frost returned the following year, softer than before. It came not with fury or sharpness, but like an old friend at the edge of memory, gentle, inevitable, and familiar. The first snow fell quietly in the middle of a sentence, during one of Jory's lessons at the edge of the cairns, as he taught the children how to tie Lene's pattern using strands of softened willow bark. They didn't stop what they were doing when the flakes began to drift. No one rushed indoors. Instead, they lifted their hands to the sky and let the snow settle on their skin, white against thread and knuckle, eyelash and cheek. Jory watched them with a feeling that was not pride. It was quieter than that, older. Perhaps this is what Erlend had once felt watching Halvor. Perhaps this is what Halvor had felt all those years ago, carrying names that had no mouths to speak them. Perhaps this was what silence felt like when it was finally shared. He placed the finished knot in the center of the third cairn's bowl, now filled not with water or light or wax, but with a bed of threads collected over many winters. Some were simple, some tangled, some still pulsed faintly when the air grew warm. The children watched him, not expectantly, just openly, and he said, "This will be the last knot we tie this season. Let it rest." They nodded, each in their own rhythm, and scattered like birds, their footsteps soft in the snow. Jory sat beside the cairn long after they were gone. He didn't tie. He didn't hum. He listened. The wind carried no voice. The river, visible only as a dark ribbon through the birch trees, flowed steadily, untroubled. And in that stillness, he heard the echo of something he hadn't felt in many years. It wasn't Vetra. Not quite. It wasn't Halvor, or Lene, or Erlend. It was the thread itself. The long, continuous motion that began not with a person, but with the very first remembering. Long before stone cairns and warm bowls, before silence had a name. The thread pulsed in him, soft and deep, and in that moment, Jory understood. The story had never been about the river, not truly. The river was only the mirror, the thread, the carrying, the weaving, the listening, that was the truth, and truth does not end. It finds new hands. That night, Jory dreamt. In the dream, he stood on a shoreline that curved forever, neither sea, nor river, nor lake, just water, limitless and still. The sky was twilight, not falling, not rising. A girl walked toward him along the waterline. Her steps left no footprints, but every place she passed was brighter than before, as if her memory reshaped the world beneath her. She looked like Lene, but she wasn't Lene. She was beyond her. A future echo. She carried no thread, and yet she glowed with it. As she passed Jory, she turned, not to speak, but to look. And in that gaze, he saw everything. The reeds, the wax, the knots, the silence, the bowl, the forgetting, the returning. She nodded once, and walked on. He woke at first light. His hands tingled. Outside, the snow had stopped. The bowl was warm, and in its center, a single sprout had emerged, pale green, coiled, waiting to rise. Jory did not live forever. He never intended to. His thread was not to stretch endlessly, only to continue. And when his time came, many seasons later, when the cairns were soft and low, and the children he once taught had begun leading lessons of their own, he asked for nothing. No stone, no feast, no song. Only this: let one child each year walk the thread, not to find something, only to listen. They honored it. Each year, when the first frost gathered in the morning grass, a child would be chosen. They would walk beyond the cairns, into the forest, across the stream. They would carry nothing. They would speak only if spoken to. And they would return when they felt the thread touch the edge of their breath. Sometimes it was a day, sometimes a week, sometimes longer, but each one returned with something small: a knot, a whisper, a gesture, a leaf pressed flat with markings no one else could see. No one explained these things. They didn't need to, because the thread continued. And somewhere, deep beneath earth and water and time, the silence still pulsed. Not asleep, not watching, just remembering. The river became just a river again. It fed the valley. It ran through fields. It glittered in the mornings and whispered at night. But to those who had heard it once, not with ears, but with the part of themselves that cannot be named, it was more. It was the place where names had once rested, where memory had once been knotted into breath, where silence had once returned home. And above it, the cairns remained, covered in moss, worn smooth by seasons, but never forgotten, because forgetting is not what threads do. They pull gently, they fray, they twist, they rejoin, and in the hands of the quiet-hearted, they begin again. So if you find yourself someday walking by water and feel something stir just beyond sound, a hum, a rhythm, a hush inside your ribs, tie a knot. Not to bind, not to explain, just to say, I heard you, and I'm still listening. Snow fell without urgency that winter. It came in slow, whispering layers, each flake its own breath, its own memory, and settled across the cairns, across rooftops and fields, softening the world into a hush too deep for words. The river no longer sang. It no longer carried names or warnings or light. It simply moved beneath the ice like a thought unspoken, flowing without question. The villagers, now of a generation who had never known Halvor or Erland, Lene or Vetra, still remembered them, not in stories told aloud by fireside, but in gesture, in quiet, in the way they paused at certain turns in the path, in the way they hummed when placing stones, and in the way they tied their knots. At the edge of the third cairn, the bowl, never warm now, but never empty, held a single coil of red-dyed flax. The color had faded over many winters, but it had never unraveled, never stiffened or snapped. It rested there like the echo of a farewell that had never quite finished being said. That year, the chosen child for the walk was a girl named Tova. She was small for her age, slender, quiet, often mistaken for younger than she was. But her hands were deft, her eyes steady, and when she listened, people felt it. Tova didn't speak much, but when she tied her knots, others fell silent to watch. And when her name was drawn, written on a folded square of birch bark pulled from the bowl by the village elder, no one was surprised. She rose without hesitation and bowed her head. That night, before she left, she sat beside her grandmother, who once had been taught by Jori himself. The fire crackled low. I won't be gone long, Tova said softly. Her grandmother took her hand. You'll be gone exactly as long as needed. Tova nodded. What if I don't hear it? Her grandmother smiled gently. Then the silence will teach you how. She left before sunrise, carried no pack, wore no boots, only a wool cloak, thick with the scent of smoke and juniper, and a small reed tucked behind her ear. The last spiral grown from the hill above the third cairn. She stepped from the village path onto the snow-laced deer trails and was soon out of sight. The first morning was easy. The forest knew her. The trees parted for her like old friends, and the birds did not flee at her approach. By afternoon, she found a small hollow where moss grew through the snow. She knelt there, rested her hands on the ground, and waited. Nothing spoke, nothing stirred. But when she rose, she tied her first knot, a simple loop, and left it on a low branch of a sapling pine. That night, she dreamt of reeds taller than houses, swaying without wind. On the second day, she crossed the frozen stream that marked the edge of the old hills. Her breath clouded before her, and the silence began to deepen. Not empty, but watchful. She sang to herself, softly, a tune with no words. She didn't know where it came from. It felt older than the village, older than the river. That evening, as she made camp beneath a fallen cedar, she tied a second knot, tight and small, barely visible, tucked into the cuff of her cloak. This one she didn't leave behind. This one she kept. On the third morning, she entered the glade. It wasn't marked on any path, wasn't spoken of by anyone, but it was waiting for her. A circle of stones, none taller than her knee, arranged in no pattern she recognized. Inside the circle, snow hadn't settled. The ground was bare, dry. She stepped into it and sat. No voice spoke. No light flared. But she felt it, deep beneath her, pulsing like a drum played far, far away. She listened until night fell, and when the first star blinked above her, she tied her third knot. This one was loose, fragile. She placed it in the middle of the circle and whispered, "For the part of you that never needed names." She slept in the glade and dreamed of thread, endless, spiraling, rising from the earth like breath turned visible. On the fourth day, she did not walk. She waited, and the forest came to her. A fox curled at the edge of her camp. A bird landed on her knee. The trees hummed, and the snow did not fall. She tied no knots. She unknotted the one she'd kept, watched it fall into her lap, did not retie it. That night, she cried for the first time in many years, not from sadness, but from being seen by something so vast it asked nothing of her. Only presence, only stillness, only trust. On the fifth morning, she rose and walked home. She took no markers, no shortcuts. She followed a rhythm in her chest. When she emerged from the forest edge, the village was waiting. Not with torches or shouts or questions, just silence. She walked to the third cairn, reached into the bowl, took nothing, placed nothing. She stood for a long while, then turned to the children gathered near the fire and said, "You don't have to wait for someone else to teach you how." And she smiled and walked away, not leaving, just continuing. The cairns are quieter now. The bowl is rarely touched. The spiral reeds on the hill grow wild and long. But every spring, when the thaw first sings through the birches, someone walks the thread, and the village never forgets. Because forgetting is not an end. It is only the space where the next knot begins. Some say the river is no longer special, that its time of silence and wonder has passed. But those who have sat beside it, truly sat, know better. They hear it in the way the water never forces its way forward. They see it in the spirals carved by frost on glass. They feel it in their bones when they tie their shoelaces in the morning or plait a child's hair. Because the thread is not magic. It is memory. It is listening. And it never truly ends. It only asks, softly, gently, patiently, "Will you carry me now?"